I was one of those good kids growing up. Didn't get into too much trouble, or at least when I did, I tried to make sure my parents didn't know about it, because it was important to me that people think of me as a good kid. So I behaved myself for the most part, often motivated by that desire to be known as the good kid. I had a little friend, a little girl friend who lived down the street from me when I was growing up, and we were good friends, and I often wanted to be more than friends with her. That didn't really work out, but we were good friends. My family, we were vegetarian growing up, and she also was from a family that was vegetarian. We actually lived on a campus of an Adventist school, very much like Fletcher Academy. It wasn't Fletcher Academy. And our family decided to not only be vegetarian, but we were going to be vegan. Now, this was back before it was cool to be vegan. And I bought in wholeheartedly. Going to do this, and felt a little smug and righteous about the fact that I was eating so well. And so I remember trying to convince my little friend down the street that she needed to give up eating cheese, because cheese is just unfit for human consumption. I remember those words came out of my mouth. I happen to eat cheese on a semi-regular basis nowadays. I should eat less of it, but need to get back to my reformed condition. But I can remember that my friend did not respond well to my attempts to get her to eat better. In fact, she argued with me. We went back and forth over the course of several days, each bringing arguments. We had gone and done our research and trying to convince the other that cheese should be eaten or cheese should not be eaten. And I remember after that just thinking, sort of shaking my head, thinking my little friend is not as righteous as I. I started seeing her as a bit of a rebel after that, and began to notice other things in her life that were not the way they should be. Her choice in the music that she listened to, not the best. Her choice of friends, not the greatest. And then the guy she ended up dating, really a bad choice. And I remember looking down my nose at my friend and feeling so superior. You know, last week, as we were looking through the Gospel of Luke, we took note of the fact that it was often outsiders who were the most receptive to truth. And sometimes the people who had the Bible and had the knowledge and thought that they were living right were the most resistant to truth, namely the most resistant to Jesus, who is the truth. Yeah, that was me as a little kid. And not just a little kid, that followed me through my teen years and has dogged me through the years, wanting to be so right, to live the truth, and to be known as someone who is good and righteous. That can actually get in the way of true righteousness. When we come to the passage this week, I've been challenged, and some people have questioned me, really, we're going to go with that next passage in Luke for the Sabbath after Thanksgiving, because it really has nothing to do with Thanksgiving, right? I mean, this is a hard passage. This is Jesus pronouncing woes upon people. Well, let's notice, first of all, that there is a Thanksgiving connection, because it takes place over a dinner. And Jesus brings some awkward conversation to that dinner. Sounds a lot like Thanksgiving to me. Jesus is invited, so here he is invited to the home of a Pharisee. This is a nice gesture on the part of a Pharisee. We often see Jesus in conflict with Pharisees, and here is a Pharisee, it seems, making a peace offering, inviting Jesus over for a meal, and Jesus proceeds to deliberately provoke the Pharisee. Could Jesus have just gone along with the tradition and had his hands washed at that meal? Probably so, certainly so, but Jesus, it seems, deliberately does not wash his hands according to the customs. in order to provoke this opportunity for him to lay it on thick. And he does. And he launches into these Pharisees. And you've got to ask yourself, what is Jesus doing? Is he just deliberately trying to be mean and rude at this dinner party? Is this the way Christians are supposed to conduct themselves? And we have to remember something about Jesus. You and I, we are not Jesus. We don't have the wisdom or the love at the level that he does to be able to pull this off. But here's what we do know about Jesus. He is perfect love embodied. He does nothing pointlessly. He doesn't get people riled up for no reason. Everything he does, everything he says has a redemptive purpose. Everything that comes out of his mouth flows from a heart of love and is designed to love and help the people who hear it. So with that in mind, how is Jesus loving and helping the Pharisees and scribes on this day? He is speaking to them with the necessary force to get their attention, because nothing else will get their attention. In the previous section, so last week, we looked at how they're clamoring for a sign. Give us a sign from heaven. Give us a sign from heaven. They're unconvinced by the signs that he's displaying in his life. He's healing the sick. He's preaching the gospel to the poor. And they are unconvinced by this. And so Jesus has to come on strong in hopes of reaching them. And we know from the book of Acts that there were a few Pharisees, maybe more than a few, who eventually accepted Jesus and joined the Jesus movement. So something did work, even though at the end of this passage, it didn't work that day. Jesus launches into these woes, and at the end of the meal, they're just outraged. They're looking for ways to get Jesus after this. They are so offended. In fact, the New Living Translation, which is what was read, does a good job of translating the way that the scribes are feeling. This is Luke 11:45. One of the scribes, the experts in the law, says, "Teacher, when you say these things, you're insulting us also." And that word, insult, is a good translation of the Greek. You have just insulted us. This is how they're feeling. Insulted by Jesus over dinner. These are words of love Jesus is speaking. So let's talk a bit about the passage so that we have a clear picture of what's going on. And then let's analyze it, and let's hear the words of love from the perspective of love. So who are these people? Pharisees and scribes. The Pharisees were a group of Jewish people who determined within themselves, we are going to be, finally, God's righteous people. Because if you look at the story throughout the Bible of God's people, they are a people that failed over and over again. They are a people that disregarded God's law over and over again. And so finally, we have on the scene a group of people who have said, no more. Our ancestors broke the law time and again. We are not going to break the law anymore. We're going to keep God's law. We're going to do it right. And they went for it. They created a system of rules around God's law so that if you kept the rules, there's no way you'd ever break God's law, because if God's law said, don't go past this point, well, we're going to make a rule that says don't go past this point, so that there's no way you're getting, in other words, these are like guardrails around the law, so that we never even get close to breaking the law. That's the idea behind the oral tradition of the rabbis that got passed down and that was in practice by the Pharisees. Now, we know about a lot of these rules and laws because they were codified in the centuries after, right after the time of Christ, and they became collected in a body of work known as the Mishnah. And the Mishnah, if you get a hold of it and read it, has these lengthy and elaborate systems of rules, one of which is about hand washing before eating, and how it was to be done, and when it was to be done, and why it was to be done. Rules governing so many aspects of life. That was the Pharisees. And by the way, there is a section in the Mishnah, it's in Sanhedrin 11:3, where it actually says that it's more important to observe the scribal interpretations than the law itself. What's the rationale for that? Well, it's a serious matter to break the law, but the law is not always clear. The scribal interpretations are very clear and exact, and so you better keep those. The hand washing, of course, which Jesus doesn't do, was part of this oral tradition, and it gets this whole conversation started. Now, Jesus pronounces woes. Some of your translations have that word where Jesus says, "Woe to you Pharisees, because you give God 1/10 of your mint, rue, and all other kinds of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. Woe." And on he pronounces woes. Now that word woe, some people interpret that as a curse, that Jesus is cursing them. And that's not true. If you think about the word woe, we still use it this way. When we say woe is me, we don't mean I'm pronouncing a curse on myself. We're basically saying, oh, poor pitiful me, I'm in trouble. That's the meaning of the word. Jesus is basically saying, you Pharisees, you're in trouble. You're pitiful. You're a mess. And I'm sorry for you. That's the idea of a woe that Jesus pronounces here. That verse I just read, Luke 11:42, you neglect justice and the love of God. Now, these two things lie at the heart of Jesus and of the prophets and of the law itself. So what Jesus is saying to them is that you are so focused on law keeping and you've gotten so caught up in the details of the law that you're missing the heart. Justice and the love of God. This is at the heart. This is what Jesus is all about. He goes on to accuse them of being unmarked graves. What's the significance of that? Well, according to the tradition, if you walked over a grave, certainly if you touched a dead body, you were defiled and unclean. You had to go through a process of purification. But even if you walked over a grave, you became unclean. So Jesus is essentially accusing them of being unmarked graves. They look great on the outside, and so they come in contact with other people, but they're really sources of defilement. That's what Jesus says to them. No wonder they're feeling insulted. He says to the scribes, you load people with burdens, but you won't lift a finger. Let me give you an example of some of what we find in the Mishnah, some of the rabbinic laws. Here are some of the Sabbath regulations. A man is not allowed to carry a burden in his right hand or in his left hand, in his bosom or on his shoulder, but he may carry it on the back of his hand, or with his foot, or with his mouth, or with his elbow, or in his ear, or in his hair, or in his wallet, or between his wallet and his shirt, or in the hem of his shirt, or in his shoe, or in his sandal. And the scribes, the experts in the law, knew all of these rules and told the people they needed to keep these rules. But you notice how many loopholes there are built into that? You're not supposed to carry stuff here and here, but there's a whole lot more places you're allowed to carry it. Well, a common person who doesn't know all the details is just going to be scared to death, like, I shouldn't be carrying anything. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Whereas a scribe who knows the law very well is aware of all the loopholes, in a sense can get through life pretty much doing what he wants to do while still looking good, while everybody else is burdened down. You load people with burdens and you won't lift a finger. And then Jesus says, you build monuments to the prophets, but really you're just like your fathers who killed the prophets. In other words, I think what Jesus is saying is those monuments you build are more like notches in your belt rather than places of sorrow for the death of the prophets. Jesus is accusing them of being in agreement with their parents who killed the prophets rather than sympathetic to the prophets. And then Jesus says, this generation is going to be guilty of the blood of all the prophets. And he mentions Abel, and then he mentions Zechariah. Now, this is not Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. This is another Zechariah. And we read about that Zechariah in 2 Chronicles. It's actually chapter 24. What's interesting about that, we don't get this in the way we arrange the Old Testament in the Christian Bible. But in the Hebrew Old Testament, well, I should say the Hebrew Scriptures, 2 Chronicles is the last book. So you've got a prophet in Genesis, and you've got a prophet in the last book. Jesus has bookended the entire Hebrew Bible by citing a prophet that was killed. Now, of course, it's interesting that Abel is considered a prophet by Jesus. I wouldn't have thought that Abel was a prophet, but the life that he lived, the testimony that he gave, Jesus considers him to be a prophet. And Zechariah was certainly a prophet. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this Zechariah that Jesus refers to here. Now, this made me sad because as a kid growing up, one of my favorite Bible stories was about King Joash. Any of you remember the story of King Joash, the boy king, right? He had there was a wicked queen on the throne, Athaliah, and she killed the whole royal family, but the priest, Jehoiada, had saved Joash, the crown prince. And so he's hidden in the temple, and Athaliah has her evil reign, and then one day, when little Joash is ready, he's still a little kid, they bring him out in the temple, and they proclaim him king. And Athaliah comes in and sees this, and shouts treason and all the rest, and they take her away, and Joash becomes king. Oh, what a great story, especially as a kid. I love this. Joash, the boy king. And Joash did good things. He restored the temple. His uncle Jehoiada helped him. And as long as Jehoiada was alive, all went well. But 2 Chronicles 24 tells us that when Jehoiada died, things went sideways. That good King Joash became bad King Joash. That he listened to other advisors who suggested to him that they neglect the temple and start worshiping other gods, which he did. And when Zechariah, who was the son of Jehoiada the priest, came along and said, "Stop it," the king ordered him to be killed, and they killed him in the sanctuary of all places. A king who gave into idolatry and killed a prophet. Jesus pulls all this in, and they know the scriptures, so they're aware of these stories. All of this is brought in. Unmarked graves, people who kill prophets like Zechariah. This is who you are, Jesus says. So what is Jesus hoping to accomplish in the hearts of these people? This speech of love. What does it mean? How do we apply it? Well, let's notice, first of all, what the solution is not. Because one temptation for us as we read this is to say, look, Jesus, he's disregarding with the custom about hand washing. Probably those Pharisees were totally off base. They're so observant about the law, we might expect Jesus to come along and say, quit keeping the law. But that's not what he says. He actually says, you are so careful about tithing, but you neglect justice and the love of God. You really should be paying attention to justice and the love of God without neglecting the tithing. Did you catch that? Jesus says, you're doing right to tithe. That's in the law. You should do that. This is not about throwing out all the rules. But you are using your rule keeping as a cover and an excuse to ignore what's really going on in your hearts. And that's what Jesus is interested in. Justice and the love of God are heart issues that flow from the heart. And when Jesus talks about the outside versus the inside of the cup, this is what he's getting at. You're so worried about externals. You're worried about what people think of you. You want those greetings in the marketplace. But inside, you're filled with greed. Focus on that. If something's clean on the inside, that's where it matters. Idolatry is insidious. Greed is one form of idolatry that wraps its tentacles around us, and we are often unaware that it has us. John Calvin famously said that the human heart is an idol factory. Left to our own devices, we will invent idols to worship. We think we're doing fine because we don't have groves with images set up in them where we go and worship. They did that back then. I lived in Thailand for 5 years, and the first year I lived there, I was continually startled by the amount of blatant idolatry around me. Images to the Buddha and the Hindu gods were everywhere. You know what was even more shocking and disturbing to me is that after living there about a year, I stopped seeing it. It was just so commonplace. Around here, we don't see images to false gods, or do we? Because anything can become an idol if it becomes the thing that provides us with meaning and value and significance, the thing that we make sacrifices to. What do you sacrifice for? Is it for your career? For your bank account? Is it for your family? Family is a good thing. A job is a good thing. Even wealth is a good thing. But if those things become the things that you sacrifice for, the things that you look to provide meaning in your life, they have become your gods, and they are idols. Joash was worshiping idols, and he killed a prophet who came to tell him about it. Jesus points to the cure for idolatry in this passage. And one way we can look at this is to look at the attitude about money that Jesus points towards in this passage. Jesus says, you're tithing, and you're very careful about your tithe. That's good. You should be doing that. But then he says this kind of cryptic thing. He says, give what is inside the dish to the poor, and then everything will be clean. And the translators and commentators debate a little bit about how to translate this and how to understand it. But I think the general meaning comes through clearly enough. Jesus is more interested about what's on the inside, and Jesus is encouraging giving to the poor. Now, let's think about the Pharisees. They're already observing the law. They're already tithing. Some of that tithe money actually was used to support the poor. These are people who are doing all the right things. They're already giving. But Jesus says to them, you really want to have your heart right? You need to be giving more. Because here's the thing, it's kind of a litmus test. Your money invariably will show you your God. Just look back over your bank statement, your credit card statement for the last several months, and you will discover what is important to you. It's really hard to fake on this one. Where we spend, where we give our money, indicates where our hearts are. And Jesus says, it's not enough to give 10%. You need to be giving from the heart. In fact, giving 10%, what value is that if you're just doing it to be seen by others or to feel righteous about yourself? If it's not flowing from a heart of love, what's the point? You may give a tithe, but how open are you to the needs of people around you? Is your home open to needy people? Is your schedule available to people in need? What's the state of your heart? So how do you know? How do you know if your heart's right? How do you know if you're giving from the inside of the cup? Well, I'll suggest several ways we can test ourselves to know. One is if when you give tithe, it doesn't feel like nearly enough. If tithe hurts, you know your heart's not right. If tithe seems like, yeah, that's just a little bit, then maybe your heart is becoming clean and healed. Tithing and giving, if it's a joyous thing, it's an indicator of a heart that's clean. Also, if you don't just write the check, but you actually get invested and involved, maybe there's a charity you give to, and you feel good about yourself for giving to it. But if your heart's really in it, you're going to care about what that charity is doing. Maybe you'll sit on their board. Maybe you'll get involved as a volunteer. You know, your heart is moving in the right direction when you begin to have a ministry mindset. If the thought is this, I could make a little more money and then I would be able to help more people, you know your heart is clean. That's not usually the way we think about making more money, is it? If we're honest with ourselves. So how to become a generous person? How to become a person that's clean on the inside? Let me show you something interesting. An argument that the Apostle Paul uses with Christians that I think can help us understand how to develop a generous mindset and to have this cleanness on the inside. We find this in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Go ahead and turn there if you would. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, Paul is writing to the Corinthian church. These are people that he knows, that he has met personally and interacted with. And the context here is Paul is collecting an offering for the poor. And he wants to encourage the Corinthian Christians to give. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And we're looking at verse 8 and 9. And here's how he approaches this. He says, I am not commanding you. I am not commanding you to give. But I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. Now let's unpack that. Paul is saying, look, I am not commanding you to give. There's not a legalistic requirement here. This is not something that's written into the law, because I don't want you doing this because you have to. I want you to do this only if you want to. I'm testing the sincerity of your love. In other words, I want to see if your hearts are clean on the inside. And then he says, for you know the grace of our Lord. You know the generosity that Jesus has. Though he was rich, he became poor, so that through his poverty, you might be made rich. You've received so much. Look at Jesus. Look at his generosity towards you. Look at all that he gave to you at great cost to himself. And if that moves your heart, if you appreciate the gift of Christ for you, then give in accordance with that. No legalistic requirement. 10%, that's the magic number you've got to give. No, the standard for giving is the standard of Christ himself. The standard of giving is the standard of love. The standard of giving is a heart that is clean and transformed and filled with God's love. That's a high standard. But the only way we reach that standard is not by trying harder, not by studying the law more closely. It is by doing exactly what Paul is doing for the Christians in Corinth, calling them to consider Christ. Friend, if you want your heart to be changed, if you want to be clean on the inside, you need a fresh look at Jesus. You need to be reminded of his grace. You need to contemplate what he has done for you and just how much he has given for you. And this ties back to last week's message. If you want to know truth, you've got to look at Jesus and keep looking at Jesus. We would do well to spend a thoughtful hour each day contemplating the life of Christ. It's transformative. When we see the generosity of Jesus to us, our hearts are changed. When we see the grace of God for us, friends, Jesus didn't come to save righteous people, self-righteous people. He came to save sinners like you and me. He came and he gave everything for you and for me. When we see the length of the chain that was let down for us, our hearts are melted with contrition. We are transformed and changed and cleaned on the inside by the grace of God. To the degree that you are aware of God's grace, to that degree you will experience transformation in your life. Do you live life with an attitude of fear and grasping, and if I don't take care of all the details, I'm not going to be okay? You're not aware of God's grace and goodness and care for you. As you begin to appreciate his love and care, to that degree, you will begin to experience peace and confidence and trust and rest and cleanness. And out of that abundant, overflowing spring of love in your heart, put there by Jesus, you will be a person who gives. And maybe you don't have a lot of money to give, and that's okay. Jesus isn't saying you got to give away a lot of money. To those who have what they have, be generous with it. This is a season of Thanksgiving, so we've got to tie this to Thanksgiving somehow. It's a season of Thanksgiving. And what do you have to give? Maybe all you have is a thankful heart. And if so, that is enough. But don't let your thanksgiving be something forced from you, merely to comply with the societal expectation and rule that you be thankful. Jesus says, I'm interested in the heart. I want to see a heart that is thankful, a heart that is filled with love, a heart that overflows. That's what matters. Let me clean your heart. Let me give you a thanksgiving heart that lasts throughout the year. Are you the kind of person that is more critical of others or more thankful? Are you the kind of person that tends to see the thorns or the roses in life? Examine yourself. And if you find that you've got some dirt on the inside, if you're focused on the negative, if it's hard to be thankful, if it's hard to give, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look at how he gives. Look at the generosity that he gives to you. And let that flow through you and out of you. Sometimes we do have to be deliberate about it. When you're having trouble being thankful, sit yourself down and make a Thanksgiving list. When you're having trouble being generous, write that check, even though it hurts. Sometimes these actions can prime the heart, help awaken us to our need. Don't be mad at Jesus at the end of dinner with him. Recognize that he's reaching out to you in love. Sometimes he speaks words that seem insulting, but they're for your good and for mine. Words that we need to hear. When the prophets speak and call us on the carpet for our idolatry, let us turn away from the idols and enthrone Jesus within. Let's pray together. Father, the one true God, the one worthy of all worship and adoration, we want you enthroned in our hearts. We want to worship you and you alone. Forgive us for our idolatry. Forgive us for the way that we try to look good on the outside, even though inside we're greedy and unthankful and focused on everything but you. Thank you for your mercy towards us. Thank you that even though we are such a mess, Jesus came to save sinners like us. Help us to receive your grace, to be transformed by it, and to freely give our time, our money, our thanks. In his name we ask. Amen.